We are still here waiting for new Orioles ownership to extend one of their current players. And while we would love to see Adley Rutschman or Gunnar Henderson or Jordan Westberg on that list, maybe the first and most likely one is actually Zach Eflin. I'll tell you why, coming up on this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast.
You are Locked On Orioles, your daily Baltimore Orioles podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey there, Orioles fans. Today is Tuesday, February 25th, 2025, and welcome back into the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. As always, I'm your host, Connor Newcomb. And coming up on today's episode, we're going to take a look back at the 2 months that the Orioles had Zach Eflin in 2024 after acquiring him from the Rays at the trade deadline. We'll talk about what went right in his short time with the Orioles, what went wrong, and then the O's got him with a year and a half of control left. So he remains in Baltimore for 2025. We'll look at the biggest storylines for Eflin heading into this year and why an extension could make sense for him and for the O's. But that's all coming up on this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast. Before we get there, just did want to thank you for making Locked On Orioles your first listen of the day every day, as we are back here in spring training, back to 5 episodes per week, Monday through Friday. You can find us wherever you find your podcast. Make sure to subscribe there. If you could leave a 5-star rating and a review, whether it's Apple Podcasts or Spotify, that really, really helps out the show. And of course, we're here on YouTube. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to the Locked On Orioles YouTube channel. If you have any thoughts about the show, questions for mailbags, whatever it may be, you can always email us, lockedonorioles@gmail.com. So let's jump into it. I've been doing my 2024 season review series for pretty much every player on the Orioles 40-man roster throughout the offseason. And we only have 4 players remaining, 4 of their biggest name guys. And the final pitcher I haven't gotten to yet is Zach Eflin, and we're going to talk about him today. Eflin, who came over from the Rays in a trade at the deadline, and down the stretch with the Orioles made 9 starts through 55 1/3 innings and posted a 2.60 ERA with a 3.94 FIP. He had his usual minuscule walk rate. It was a little bit higher, but still 4.9% with the Orioles, and 21% was the strikeout rate. Now, overall for Eflin's season, he struggled a little bit more for Tampa Bay, but overall last year, he made 28 starts between the Rays and the Orioles, 165 1/3 innings, and a 3.59 ERA. Still a productive 2.8 Fangraphs WAR season. Wasn't the year he had the year before in Tampa when he made 31 starts, had a 3.5, and was worth almost 5 WAR, but he was still a very productive pitcher for the Rays. So let's start with what went right for Zach Eflin last season. And I think what went right was that may have been, that was easily a top 3 trade that Mike Elias has made as GM. And you could argue it was the best deal for a starting pitcher made at last year's trade deadline. If you just go by ERA and honestly most other statistics, there was not a starting pitcher who performed better in the final 2 months for his new team that was traded at the deadline last year than Zach Eflin. The Orioles got the best pitcher that was traded. They sent 3 players over to Tampa Bay. Mac Horvath, kind of a utility infield outfielder guy, 2nd-round pick out of North Carolina in 2023. Orioles had high hopes for him, thought he was really projectable, was posting a 745 OPS in high A Aberdeen, but he did go to the Rays and he had a 35% strikeout rate and a 672 OPS in high A with Tampa after the trade. He's one of those hitters where if he popped, he would have been real helpful for the Orioles, but also with so much talent at the big league level, he was kind of expendable, and he was a little bit more of a high variance prospect at this point, was nothing like a slam dunk. Then there was the outfielder Matthew Etzel. Orioles took him in the 10th round out of Southern Miss in 2023. He was awesome in Aberdeen, had a 141 WRC plus there, so the Orioles bumped him up to Bowie, and he actually played 32 games in Double-A Bowie, now of course Double-A Chesapeake, before the trade deadline. Was more of a league average hitter in Bowie, but then he went to Tampa Bay, and just like Horvath, had his strikeout rate skyrocket. 35%, was basically a league average hitter in Double-A with the Rays. He was definitely a breakout prospect early in 2024 for the Orioles after being a 10th round selection, but that was the one that made the most sense to trade. You're going to take a 10th round outfielder, going to be maybe just end up being a depth guy for your organization, and he starts to pop one year. That is the best time to trade him, because 10th round talent, sometimes those guys are going to get to the big leagues. And hopefully for Matthew Etzel's sake, he does get to the big leagues with the Rays or another team. But his value was never going to be higher than it was at the deadline last year. And that, of course, helped the Orioles get Eflin. Now, the one out of the three players that could hurt the O's is Jackson Ballmeister. He was the Orioles' competitive balance B round pick in 2023. Notice these were all 2023 draft picks. Probably three guys who the Rays had some interest in taking in that 2023 draft, and the Orioles scooped up all of them. But the O's picked Ballmeister 63rd overall. It was the highest Elias had ever drafted a pitcher since taking over the Orioles front office in November of 2018. And he was really good with Aberdeen. 3.06 ERA with the Ironbirds, 30% strikeout rate, a very concerning 14% walk rate. But he went to Tampa and he exploded in high A down the stretch of the season. A 1.24 ERA. Strikeouts went up, walks went down. He looked great for the Rays. Now, he still hasn't made it to Double A. That's what he'll probably do in 2025, and then we'll really see what truly kind of pitching prospect he is. But the O's had high hopes for him. But you also got to give up good players to get good players. And to give up a guy who was in Single A to get a year and a half of a really good major league starting pitcher, that is still worth it. And I see this as one of the best trades Elias has made. I mean, it wasn't just a rental. They got a year and a half of Eflin. And it was cool, too, that Zach Eflin was due $18 million for 2025. And David Rubenstein was like, yeah, of course, go get him. And Elias did so. And it's very nice to have Eflin now going into this season. But in terms of the Zach Eflin of it all, obviously the trade was good, but he just doesn't walk guys. That's probably the best part of his game at this point. He just doesn't walk guys. He had a 2.8% walk rate in his time with the Rays before the trade. That was 19 starts with Tampa Bay, over 110 innings. And it jumped to 4.9% with the Orioles. And the 3.5% walk rate he had for the entire season, Rays and O's, that was second lowest in Major League Baseball among qualified starters. Now, if you just look at his Orioles walk rate of 4.9%, that's still great, but it's not like top five. It was 17th in baseball in the final 2 months. But the reason why it was quote unquote so high, remember, Major League average walk rate is still 8%. So for Eflin to jump to 5%, it's still way better than average in terms of walking. And it was really all because of his final start in the regular season. It was in New York. He clearly didn't have it that day. Something was off. He walked 5 batters and only struck out 1 in 4 2/3. Actually did a nice job of only allowing 3 runs despite walking 5 batters in Yankee Stadium against that Yankee offense. But 5 walks for Eflin was a career high. He had never walked 5 batters in a game. Remember, he debuted with the Phillies in 2016, and he had never walked 5 batters in a game until his final regular season start last year with the Orioles. And that super inflated his walk rates. You take out that 1 start of 5 walks, he had 6 total walks in the first 8 starts with the Orioles. Never did he walk multiple batters in 1 start with the O's before he walked 5. So that really inflated things. If you take that out, it's a 3% walk rate in that stretch of 8 starts. That was 3rd lowest among qualified starters in Major League Baseball. It is strike after strike after strike, which really allows you to enjoy to watch him pitch. He works pretty fast. He pounds the strike zone. It's a nice change of pace from some other guys that you will see out on the mound. And the Orioles, while the walks went up a little bit, mostly because of that last start, they, in a more real way, got the strikeouts up. With the Rays, he was at an 18.9% strikeout rate. With the Orioles, it jumped to 21%. Now, remember, again, big league average is 22%, so he's still not some sort of strikeout monster, but they at least got him closer to average and closer to what he was doing in 2023 with the Rays. That's when he posted a 27% K rate with a 3% walk rate, and it was like, this guy is awesome. He wasn't quite that, but he still was able to miss some more bats. And Eflin's great when he's pounding the zone, not walking guys, but when he's a pitch-to-contact guy, there has to be some good luck involved. If you're allowing that many balls to be put in play, baseball can be a game full of luck. And if a ball bounces one different way, floats in somewhere, the more you allow the ball to be put in play, the more risk you take on. So that's why pitchers are always hunting strikeouts and hunting missing bats, because you don't let them put the ball in play, generally nothing bad can happen to you as long as you're not walking a million guys. And Eflin already has that floor of, hey, even if his walks go up a little bit, it's still not an issue. So we'll take a little bump in the walks if we get a bump in the strikeouts. And that's why when he did that with the Orioles, his ERA jumped from 4+ with the Rays to 2.60 in those 9 starts with Baltimore. And a lot of it was due to just a change in usage and how he attacked hitters. If you're watching here on the Locked On Orioles YouTube page. You can see this chart via StatCast and Baseball Savant. This is Zach Eflin's pitch usage month by month throughout the 2024 season. He's obviously a high usage guy. They count his slider as a different pitch. So theoretically, cutter, curveball, sinker, changeup, sweeper, four-seamer, and slider. Theoretically, he threw 7 different pitches, but he rarely threw the usual slider. So really, it's a 6-pitch mix for Zach Eflin. And you can see, the Orioles made that trade right at the end of July. So really start looking in August and September. And what changed? You can see the sinker usage goes way, way down for Eflin, as does the four-seam fastball usage. He barely used it by the end of the season. And instead, at the top with the cutter, that is the pitch that went up and became, no doubt about it, his number one pitch in those final 2 months with the Orioles. He also used more curveballs with Baltimore. His changeup usage went up. His sweeper usage went up. He was using more of the secondaries. And basically, instead of his cutter being like a tight slider, he was going Corbin Burns mode, and he was using his cutter as his main fastball. And that was working. And that mix did great things for him because those were his better pitches. His sinker and his fastball were kind of just get me over pitches, where the other ones were getting the outs. So he just kind of started to throw them more, and it worked out. Now, the cutter in Tampa Bay, as you can see, was still at worst barely his number 2 pitch, and at times with the Rays was still his most used pitch. Now with the Rays, he was throwing his sinker almost as much as the cutter. He dropped a lot of that sinker in Baltimore, but it was still one of his favorite pitches, and not like the Orioles found the cutter out of nowhere. But while they had him throw it a little bit more, they also had him change the location of that cutter. So this next chart you're going to see is also from Baseball Savant and StatCast. This is where Eflin threw his cutter in 2024 in those first 110 innings when he was still with the Tampa Bay Rays. Now you can see he was throwing it a lot to lefties. Generally righties with cutters throw them to neutralize lefties. That's how Corbin Burns uses his cutter a lot. So he was throwing it to lefties, kind of a lot of up and away, but also a lot of down and in, and then a good chunk of up and in as well. And those usages were working okay, but the cutter was getting hit a little bit, especially when it was in that down and in spot. He couldn't throw it to the back foot enough. It was leaving it over the strike zone. It was in the sweet zone, that down and in sweet spot for a lot of left-handed hitters. Now we changed the chart to this is where he threw the cutters just in those 2 months with the Orioles in those 9 starts. You can see he's still throwing it some up and in and some down and in, but he focused a lot more of those cutters up and away to left-handers. He was already doing it some with the Rays, but the Orioles made it a key focus. Like, this is where we want you most of the time to throw that cutter. And when he was able to get that cutter up and away, he got some called strikes, a little backdoor pitch, got a lot of soft grounders, some pop-ups. It was even getting swing and misses. Like, guys were swinging under the cutter when he was throwing it up and away in the zone. And that placement, just for some reason, allowed it to work a little bit more. And all of a sudden, he was getting more whiffs on the cutter. And by the end of the season, per StatCast, Eflin had a plus 14 run value on his cutter. That is really, really good. Remember, 0 basically league average in that stat, plus 14 on the run value. That was the 5th best cutter in all of Major League Baseball. Only Corbin Burns, known for the cutter, Emmanuel Clase, known for his 102-mile-per-hour cutter, David Robertson, still pitching at 40 because he learned his cutter from Mariano Rivera and throws the same one. And then a nice season from Jamison Tyone. Those were the only 4 pitchers in the majors who had a better cutter by run value than Zach Eflin last year. So the Orioles just said, we think it works up. We think it works a lot. Just throw it there and throw it more. And nobody could get on it. Now, there may be some issues with throwing that cutter that much, and we'll get to that in a moment. But for now, it was working out fantastically. And then he also went after the lefties with that curveball as well. The curveball had generally swing and miss rates of around 30% with the Rays. That's pretty solid for a breaking pitch. You'll absolutely take 30%. But in those final 2 months with the Orioles, he threw more curveballs, and the whiff rate was pushing 50%. Half the time guys were swinging at that curveball in the final 2 months, they were swinging and missing. That is like the elite of the elite on swing and miss rate. So he was looking to miss more bats, and he did it with the cutter and the curveball. And here's the thing, besides that last weird start in Yankee Stadium, didn't really give up anything that makes his command so pristine. So the Orioles were able to get him better, where maybe at worst, marginally upping his walk rate, but still to a point where it's super, super low, and he still throws a lot of strikes. They kind of turned him into the ideal starter to have in the middle of your rotation going down the stretch. And it's just great to have that large pitch mix with 6 pitches. It's something that's probably going to happen more and more this season in the majors. And all that allowed him to just keep the O's in every game. He did not allow more than 3 earned runs in any of his 9 starts with the Orioles, and 7 of his 9 starts with the O's were quality starts. The only ones that weren't was because he couldn't finish the full 6 innings. Otherwise, like, the O's had a legitimate, serious chance because of starting pitching to win all 9 games that Eflin started for them down the stretch, and even the one playoff game that he started as well, which we'll get to. It was just what the doctor ordered for that Orioles rotation to go behind Corbin Burnes. And he helped be part of the, hey, it wasn't the pitching that knocked the Orioles out of the playoffs. In fact, they scored 1 run in 2 games against the Royals. Some of that was because Zach Eflin really stabilized that rotation down the stretch. But everything was not perfect. There's a reason why we're not sitting here and saying, well, the Orioles don't need an ace. They have Zach Eflin. He's a bona fide number 1 at the top of their rotation that they traded for. There's still reasons why he's more of a number 2 or a number 3, and we will talk about those coming up next. So for all the great things that Zach Eflin did for the Orioles rotation last season, it wasn't perfect, and there's still things that he can improve on, and still things that may have gone wrong when we look back on his 2024 season. And I'll start with the last 2 starts were a little weird. Now, I mentioned the one at Yankee Stadium already. He ended the regular season 4 2/3 innings, 3 runs on 4 hits, with 1 strikeout and 5 walks. Again, as I mentioned, most walks he had ever given up in a single start of his career. It just was weird. He was all off. It was very odd watching him. And it was a little concerning because it was like, hey, this is his final start before he presumably pitches game 2 of the postseason for the Orioles. You didn't love that he looked by far the worst that he had in a Baltimore uniform right before maybe the biggest start of his career. So that was a little concerning. And then he also he wasn't his usual self in the wild card start. Like, he got the start in game 2 after the Orioles had lost 1-0 after a great start by Corbin Burnes in game 1, season on the line. They go to Zach Eflin. I mean, we knew coming in it was going to be Burnes game 1, Eflin game 2. There were questions, would it be Dean Kramer, Cade Povich, or someone else? And if the Orioles got to game 3, but we knew it was going to be Burnes, Eflin 1 and 2. And even with that weird start at the end of the year, still felt great about Eflin. And he wasn't bad. It was just that when you throw Zach Eflin out there, you're expecting 6+ innings and breezing through the game. He only lasted 4. Now, he only gave up 1 run on 4 hits, 3 strikeouts, and a walk. He wasn't walking guys, didn't walk 5 guys again, which was good. And some of that was because because Corbin Burnes had given them 8 1/3 innings the night before, the Orioles had a fully rested bullpen. And Brandon Hyde had the ability, knowing, hey, this is going to be a close game. I can get to my pen. They're rested. They're pitching well, and they can get us to the finish line. And the bullpen did pitch well. The bullpen allowed just 1 run over the next 5 innings. Of course, the Orioles lost the game 2-1 because they couldn't score. It wasn't on the pitching, and Hyde played the matchups very, very well down the stretch in that game. So some of the reason he only went 4 was because they wanted him out. He also, the pitch count was pretty high. It was 75 pitches in 4 innings. You're trying to stay around high 50s to 60 through the first 4 innings. So he was coming closer to the end of the line than you would think. But it wasn't the super crisp stuff that he had before. So you do hope it was just kind of a fluke at the end of the year and he'll be fine. Now, he did make an IL trip like seemingly every other pitcher the Orioles had last year. He went on the injury list on August 20th. It was retroactive to August 17th for right shoulder inflammation. It did not sound good at the time. A couple days later, we heard that, hey, it's more precautionary. They just want to shut him down for a bit. He'll be fine. And he was activated September 1st to start again in Colorado. He missed only the minimum 15 days on the IL, and he was right back. And he seemed to be fine when he returned. Like, he came back for that start in Colorado right off the injured list and went 7 innings, 1 run, 9 strikeouts. So it was like, yeah, he's probably fine because 9 was the most Ks he had in any start with the Orioles, and that was at Coors Field. So it looked like he was pretty much okay, and he pitched well down the stretch for the Orioles as well, except for that last outing after the shoulder thing. But any arm issues, shoulder, elbow, forearm, whatever, always something to monitor, and it just puts a little something in the back of your head heading into this year. But I think the biggest thing to critique from Eflin is something we already talked about, the high cutter usage, how good the pitch was, how much he threw it. He threw it more and more as the season went on. Overall, between the Rays and the Orioles, it was still his number 2 most used pitch. He threw it 28% of the time. The sinker, he threw 29% of the time. But if you split it up month to month last season for Eflin, in August, 29% most used pitch. In September, cutter 33% of the time, again, was his most used pitch. Now, that is not something anywhere close to Corbin Burnes. Corbin Burnes 45% cutters. That is it is his main fastball. It's his number one pitch. No one in baseball among starters threw a higher percentage of cutters than Corbin Burnes did at 45% last year. And we see Corbin Burnes do it. It is possible to operate as a pitcher, throwing 30% or more cutters, having it be your main fastball and be dominant and get people out. Now, maybe is it because Corbin Burnes is just built different? Like, yeah, he is. He's a Cy Young winner. He's one of the top 5 pitchers in baseball. We know that very well. It's hard to compare anyone to Corbin Burnes. And that's where there might be an issue, because most guys are able to throw a sinker or a four-seam fastball enough as their main fastball to play the cutter off of it and not have that be the one dominant pitch. Like in September for Zach Eflin, with the 33% cutters, he threw 19% sinkers. That was down from, close to 30% with the Rays. And opponents hit 440 against that sinker with an average exit velocity of 92 miles an hour in the month of September. That is not good. That is a pitch that when it's getting hit like that, you don't really want to throw it. And he basically fully went away from his four-seam fastball. He only threw 3% four-seam fastballs in September as well. That usage kept dropping with the O's. So yeah, pitchers have been able to do it before with the high cutter usage. But if the cutter isn't perfect, you need at least one of those other fastballs, whether it's the four-seamer or the sinker. You need one of them to at least be good enough to be a get-me-over pitch, get some lazy fly balls with this, in the sinker's case, get you some ground balls, to get you some quick outs, and be able to locate it for quality strikes. And I guess the Orioles didn't feel like he could do that consistently last year, because he ended up being 4th in Major League Baseball among qualified starters in cutter usage at 28%. I mean, Burnes threw it at 45%. The number 2 person is down at 32%. So Burnes isn't really a good comparison because nobody does it among starters like Corbin Burnes. You have guys like Tyone and Cutter Crawford, who unsurprisingly throws mainly a cutter up there in the 30s. But you look at even the top 10, like 10th on that list is 19% cutter usage. 1/5 of the time throwing it is the 10th most among starters. It's not a pitch that a lot of guys use as their main fastball or even one of their main pitches. And yet that is where Eflin is. So he has talent that guys don't have. Like nobody really is posting as minuscule walk rates, and nobody really has the command and control that Zach Eflin shows out there night in and night out. So he is certainly different in that way. The question really is, can he be different in the way that he can throw 30+% cutters, have it be his main fastball, toss in the four-seamer and the sinker every now and then to mix it up, but have a cutter be your main fastball. More relievers can do it, but it is tough for starters. And I think that's a big question. I'm sure he worked on the sinker and worked on the four-seamer this offseason to get them back to more usable like they were, especially in 2023 with the Tampa Bay Rays. But that's what I'm really intrigued to see in these first couple of spring training starts for Eflin, like what the usage looks like for the cutter and the other fastballs and how he feels about those things going into 2025. But that's not even the biggest storyline. Those are just something to watch. I think the biggest storyline is like, is he the ace of this staff? And will he stick around beyond this year? We'll talk about that to finish off the show coming up next. But first, this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast is brought to you by FanDuel. When the game tips off, the NBA action is just getting started, and there is no better place to get in on the action than FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. With FanDuel, you can place live bets throughout the game, so even if you miss the opening tip-off or want to bet on a fourth quarter comeback, you can stay in the action. And if you're looking for a bigger payout, you can even combine your live bets into a same-game parlay. Now, FanDuel's live betting feature is great because it keeps every moment exciting. Whether you're looking for a late-game rally or backing your team, you can never miss your chance. Plus, the app is easy to use, and when you win, you get paid instantly. And right now, new FanDuel customers can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. That's FanDuel.com for your shot at $150 in bonus bets. Make every moment more with FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the NBA. So to finish things off here on a Tuesday, talking about Zach Eflin, let's discuss his biggest storylines heading into 2025. And I think the first one is, which we've talked about a bunch on this podcast already, will he have to be the ace of this Orioles staff? The O's lose Corbin Burnes to the Arizona Diamondbacks. At this point, again, remember, the Dylan Cease trade last year was made between the Padres and the White Sox on March 13th, so it is still possible the Orioles could add some sort of number one before spring training is over, but it's less and less likely, obviously, as the days go by. They haven't really replaced the ace. They're hoping Grayson Rodriguez takes a step forward. Eflin can be as good as he has been. But does he start opening day? I talked about it last week. I see the merits of both. Eflin started opening day for the Orioles or for the Rays last year. He's more of the veteran, but Rodriguez, the Orioles more see as like the future ace of this staff moving forward. Maybe you want to reward him with his first career opening day start. But also on the flip side, does it make Eflin more likely to re-sign here if he gets an opening day start with the Orioles as he does become a free agent after 2025? But the bigger question is, like, you know, he was the opening day starter for the Rays last year, but I wouldn't have called him the ace of the staff, really. Can you call him that for the Orioles? And if Eflin does end up being your best pitcher, which the best version of Zach Eflin, I think you can have a playoff team with him being your best starting pitcher. That's how good he can be. That's how good he was in those 9 starts down the stretch with the Orioles last year. If he can just repeat that, like, yeah, you'd take a 2.6 ERA pitcher as your best starter. But can you be a great rotation? Can you win a World Series with Zach Eflin as your ace? I love Zach Eflin. I'm not sure if you can. And again, it all depends on who's behind him. How well is Grayson pitching? How good does Dean Kramer look? Can Sugano fit into this role? Do you get a lot from Morton? Does Povich really step up? There's all those questions obviously behind him. Do the Orioles add at the deadline? That's a big question here. Again, if Eflin remains the number one on this staff, or at least for the beginning of the season. But just as a bigger picture thing, I don't know if you would say World Series rotation for one that starts with Zach Eflin. He's an amazing number 2 or number 3, but if he's your number 1, that's where the question marks come in. Either way, the Orioles are hoping that, Grayson Rodriguez, and when Kyle Bradish hopefully gets back healthy at some point late in this season, the two of them developing into young aces like we've seen in spurts from Grayson, and we saw from Bradish when he was healthy back in 2023. They're hoping for those things as well, and they still have the budget to go out and potentially trade for somebody at the deadline, pay a starter. Maybe next offseason there'll be a lot of good arms like Dylan Cease and Framber Valdez and others available next year. That's still a possibility. Eflin would be a perfect number 2 or number 3 to fit behind those guys. Like, if you were to put together a rotation in the offseason where you added an ace, like you signed Framber Valdez, you had Grayson Rodriguez and Kyle Bradish behind him, and then Zach Eflin was your number 4 going into 2026, like, that is a scary good starting rotation for the Orioles to have, and I'm sure they would love something like that. And even if they don't do that, but Grayson shows he's ace material, and Bradish shows he's healthy, even Rodriguez, Bradish, Eflin, 1, 2, 3 is, I think, a really good top 3 heading into 26. But that's your question, because Zach Eflin, even though you got him for a year and a half, that's great. He now is in his contract here. He becomes a free agent after this 2025 season. The Orioles are paying him $18 million on the end of the 3-year, $40 million contract he got from the Rays a couple of years ago. I think even if the Orioles don't extend him, they should be in the market, obviously depending on how he pitches this year, but should be in the market to bring him back next offseason. But wouldn't it be easier to just try and extend him now? Like, I know that the Gunners and the Adleys and the Jordan Westburg and Colton Cowsers, like, those are the big names we want to see extended. But if the Orioles want to ease into it and find maybe an easier candidate, I know it is a little risky, right? Just a little bit risky to give extensions to pitchers, especially ones that, are about to turn 31 years old. I get that. But he just feels like the perfect extension candidate. Like, I think a 3-year deal that covers 2026, 27, and 28. So you get him for ages 32, 33, and 34. Still not super old, and especially for a guy who doesn't rely on velocity. If he's throwing that cutter mainly as his fastball, that pitch is 89. His hardest pitch, the 4-seamer, averaged 92.3 miles an hour last year. It's not like this guy's throwing heat. He is a huge command-oriented pitcher. I would think a guy like that can age even better into his mid to late 30s. I wouldn't be scared at all to have, even at the end of a contract like that, a 34-year-old Zach Eflin in my rotation. The Orioles are employing a 35-year-old Tomoyuki Sugano and a 41-year-old Charlie Morton in their rotation right now. So it'd be like a youngster in there, Zach Eflin, in a couple of years at 34. Now, the going rate for pitching is getting pretty expensive, and Nathan Eovaldi is a different pitcher than Eflin, but I put him in a similar category, and Eovaldi got 3 years, $75 million this offseason to return to the Rangers, and Eflin's probably looking at that and saying, hey, I got a nice contract, but I can get a better contract in free agency next year. But if he likes Baltimore, and I think it's interesting that he is living with like Gunnar and Colton and Adley in spring training this year, that tells me a 30-year-old guy living with those at least slightly younger guys, more of a veteran that didn't come up with those guys, tells me he is assimilating into the clubhouse very well. If he likes Baltimore, if he likes being with the O's, and they can offer up something like 3 years, 70-ish million for an extension, that's what it costs to get pitching now. And if Elias likes what he can bring down the road, and David Rubenstein has said, like, there's no spending limit for us, he would certainly okay that if Elias wants it. I think Zach Eflin could be the perfect extension candidate. And it is hard to get extensions done during the season when a guy is in his walk year. Spring training of the walk year is really the perfect time to get those extensions done. I think it would be a great capper to this offseason. Even if the O's can't get an ace, if this time next week they're announcing a 3-year Zach Eflin extension, like, let me know in the comments. I think that would give a much more positive spin to this Orioles offseason. And I just think he's going to age well with the way he pitches. He's done amazing things for this rotation. You hope down the road he's like a really good number 3 or number 4 for you. And that's the cost of pitching. 3 years, 60 to 70 million, maybe up to 75. You get him to sign. You have him here through 2028. You answer a big question in your rotation moving forward because, right now, Eflin, Sugano, Morton, all due to become free agents after this year. You would take him off this list. I think Zach Eflin brings so much to a team trying to win a World Series in the middle of a rotation. I think he could be a candidate who has gotten one contract already, so maybe is a little more likely to do an extension instead of hitting free agency again. I think it would be a perfect move to get in the good graces of Orioles fans and really help the team moving forward to get that extension done before opening day. Unsure, don't have insight into if his agent and the Orioles are talking about something like that, but I think they should be, and hopefully they will be moving forward. But that'll do it for today's episode. Thank you so much for tuning in. That Monday spring training game was canceled because of rain, although there was no TV broadcast, no StatCast anyway, so I wasn't really going to talk about it. There is a Tuesday game, Orioles and Tigers. Charlie Morton making his O's spring training debut against one of the best pitching prospects in baseball in Jackson Jobe. But once again, there is no TV, no StatCast, and I don't even think a radio broadcast. So if anything big happens, injury-wise, whatever we get from the beat reporters, I will certainly talk about it on Wednesday's episode. If not, we're probably not going to talk about that game either because it's just kind of the realization and what happens at spring training. There's not another televised Orioles game till March 1st. That's Orioles spring training for you, but get you all the news you need to get. And we still got to review the seasons of Adley, Gunnar, and Jackson. Those are coming up later this week as well. We'll be back tomorrow for a Wednesday pod. Until then, I'm Connor Newcomb, and this has been the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.